An elderly man lived alone in his house, caring only for his dogs. People and street children used to mock him and say that he was someone bad who had committed many crimes. Until one day one of the street boys, challenged by the others, entered the house of this man. When he appeared, the boy was very afraid and asked him not to hurt him. The Lord then says that he will not do anything to him, that he is not bad. Asking where he heard this from, the boy then tells him what people said about him. The man then tells him his story, a sad and overcoming story that makes the boy cry with regret. Tony lived alone in his modest house, located on a quiet street in Brooklyn in New York. His residence was simple, with weather-worn walls and a garden at the back of the house that, although poorly maintained, housed a variety of wildflowers that grew freely. Tony had no family around, and his only company was his two faithful dogs, Max and Luna, two mutts he had found a few years earlier and who now lived with him. Max, thick-coated and intelligent-eyed, and Luna, docile and always cheerful-looking, were everything to him. Every day, Tony followed a simple routine. He woke up early, cooked his breakfast, and then took care of the dogs. He would take them for walks in the nearby park, where few people ventured to talk to him. The neighborhood considered him a strange figure and avoided at all costs the slightest contact. It was not uncommon to hear the evil whispers and murmurs as he passed through the streets, but Tony didn't seem to mind that. He was already used to it. Despite the constant chatter behind, people say he's dangerous, he's been arrested, one neighbor said to another as they swept the sidewalk. Who knows who he killed or what he did, but it's not good to get close to him. The children, influenced by the adults on the street, kept an even greater distance. For them, Tony was almost a mythological figure, a kind of monster that inhabited the street, and they saw him with a glimpse, but also with fear. But Tony never fought back or confronted the rumors. He just lived his life, staying aloof and silent, always seeming oblivious to it all. His heart, however, carried a deep sadness and loneliness that only he understood. One day, a group of children gathered at the end of one of the dead-end streets of the neighborhood were playing baseball with some makeshift bats. Among them was John. After the departure, while they were resting sitting on the sidewalk, they were talking about some mysteries and everyday things, until one of them suggested, "Let's see who has the courage to enter old Tony's house," provoked Pedro, one of the leaders of the group. The other boys laughed nervously at the proposal, but John, feeling the pressure of friends and his own curiosity, decided to accept the challenge. "I will," John said, trying to hide the nervousness in his voice. "It's nothing. You're talking out of your mouth, I bet," mocked Peter. "Of course I will, but I want to know what you guys are going to give me for it." "I have a collection of caps I can give you," said George, one of the boys. "And I have those magazines that I told you about." And so little by little the amount of objects was increasing. "And you, Pedro, what will you give me?" The boy thought well before he spoke. "I can give you some new games if you want." Which ones?" John asked excitedly. "You can choose." "Great, if so then it's done," said John, shaking Peter's hand. Then another boy, Richard, commented, "How do we know he actually got in there?" "Is he right? How do we know?" Peter said. "Please accompany me to the door." John answered, "Even then you could fool us." "I know. Bring something from his house." "Are you suggesting I steal?" It's not theft. Borrow it, then you can return it." He responded to the laughter of the others. John looked at them and said, "All right, you can laugh because you don't have the guts, but I do." The boys celebrated in surprise at that determination, and then accompanied him to the rusty gate of Tony's house that was a few houses up from where they were. They opened it carefully, making a loud creak that seemed to echo down the silent street. "Good luck, John," Peter whispered, with a tone of provocation mixed with a clear relief that he wasn't the one getting into that robbery. The boys were apprehensive, whispering among themselves as John went on alone. John took a deep breath and went into the garden. The overgrown bushes and tall grass created a gloomy atmosphere to the place, although in reality it did not differ much from the other houses. He walked toward the door, feeling every quickening beat of his heart. Just as he was about to knock, the door slowly opened with a frightening creak. On the other side of the door, Tony emerged, a tall, lean figure with gray hair and a face scarred by time. His eyes, though tired, retained a glow of gentleness. Max and Luna stood beside him, watching the intruder curiously. "Who's there?" Tony's voice was grave but not threatening. John felt a chill run down his spine. Please, sir, don't hurt me," he stammered, trying to take a step back, but his feet seemed stuck to the ground. The boys, seeing that, ran scared before Tony could see them. Tony looked at the boy with surprise and a shadow of sadness. "Hurt you? Why would I do that, boy?" His voice now had a tone of incomprehension. "Everyone says that you are dangerous, that you have done bad things," answered John hurriedly, still trembling. Tony sighed deeply and ran his hand over his face, as if trying to push away the painful memories. "Come in, boy," Tony said, walking away from the door. "Let's talk. It's time for you to know the real story." John hesitated. "Don't worry," the Lord replied. "If I wanted to hurt you, I would have done it already, don't you think?" At that moment, John's curiosity overcame his fear, and he confirmed what Tony had told him. He entered the house, observing the simple but cozy atmosphere. The room was small, with antique furniture and a comforting smell of coffee. Tony led him to an armchair and sat opposite him. The boy nevertheless still trembled with fear, wondering if it had been a wise choice to accompany that fellow into his home. And sitting in front of him, the ordinary objects took frightening forms, and he could even swear that he heard some screams coming from under the basement. Tony looked at Max and Luna, who were lying peacefully next to him. His eyes softened as he watched his faithful companions, so he finally broke that silence that made the boy completely nervous and soaked with sweat. "These two mean the world to me," he began, stroking Luna's head, who responded with an affectionate look. "After being released from prison, I was completely lost," Tony continued. "It was during one of my lonely walks that I met Max. He was just a puppy, abandoned on the side of the road, skinny and scared. I took him home, and in a way, he saved me too. Taking care of him gave me a purpose, something to focus on beyond my own pain." Tony paused, smiling at the dog. "Max was my first friend after the tragedy. He had this tireless energy and infectious joy that slowly began to heal my heart." John watched the scene, feeling a growing admiration for Tony. "And Luna?" asked the now curious boy about her story. "Luna showed up a few years later," Tony said, now petting the dog. "I was more emotionally stabilized, but I still felt very alone. One day, while walking with Max, we find Luna trapped in a poaching trap in the forest. She was hurt and scared. We took her to the vet, and after her recovery, she joined us. Luna has brought a new layer of happiness to our lives." He smiled and looked at his animals. "Well, I guess you didn't come here to hear about them, did you?" "Yes. Why were you arrested?" "What did you do?" "I killed a guy. This has been going on for more than 30 years. The boy got up scared, making mention of running from there. "Wait, you will understand. My name is Tony," he began, with a distant look. "And despite what they say, I'm not a bad man. People are afraid of what they do not understand, and often prefer to believe lies than to seek the truth." John listened intently, though rather apprehensively, looking for some sharp object to defend himself. "My life has been marked by many challenges and tragedies," Tony replied, with a sigh. "When I was young, I went through very difficult situations, and this led me to make bad decisions, which I do not regret." Tony was born in a small village up north in Alaska, a place where cold dominated and snow covered the landscape for much of the year. The surrounding mountains seemed silent guardians of the almost peaceful life of the people there, and the forests, with their tall pines, offered a safe shelter from the biting wind. Tony was the youngest of 3 brothers, and from an early age he learned to love and respect the nature that surrounded him. His father, Joachim, was a respected crab fisherman in the Bering Sea, a dangerous and demanding profession in which many of the fishermen did not return from the sea. But Joachim was an experienced man and sensible about his obligations. During the autumn months, when the boats go out to sea for fishing, he spent this long period away from home throughout the autumn and returned to live with his children and wife during the rest of the year, since although dangerous, fishing gave him an income to live comfortably for the entire following period. Tony loved the times when his father stayed with them, for these were the times when he could venture out with him. His father, Joachim, was a respected fisherman in the village. In the times when he was at home, every morning, before the sun came up, he prepared to face the ice and the frozen sea. Tony always got up early to accompany him. "Dad, can I go with you today?" he asked with bright eyes of expectation. "Of course, son. Dress well and don't forget the gloves," Joachim replied, with a smile on his face. The boat cut through the ice, and the icy sea air hit their faces as they sailed through the waters. Tony loved those mornings. He listened to his father's stories of the great catches and dangers of the sea while crabbing, learning lessons of courage and resilience, and daydreaming of the day he would be there, braving the perilous seas. But that fall, Tony was already 9 years old, when his father woke up to say goodbye to everyone. "Dad, can I go with you today?" he asked with bright eyes of expectation.
"No, son.
I am leaving for the raging sea. Near the Aleutian Islands, crab fishing is very dangerous." Today, and for the rest of the autumn, you must help your brothers gather firewood in the forest, replied Joachim, with a worried smile. Tony sighed deeply, but agreed. Don't worry, son. One of you can go too, his father replied, even hoping that it was not necessary for his son to go through it. First, you must become strong, grow up, and have a family to protect. That's what a man does. All that autumn, while his brothers, Peter and Luke, gathered firewood, he often lost himself in thought, dreaming of his father's adventures at sea. One day, I'm going to be brave like Daddy, he said to himself, determined to live up to it. Autumn followed, and at its end, Tony waited anxiously for his father's return. He knew that the next day they would go out together to fish for salmon. But it was not Joachim who returned that afternoon. It was a cold night in Alaska, and snow was quietly falling outside. Tony's family was gathered around the table, anxiously awaiting Joachim's return. Tony Donna, Clara's mother, tried to keep the mood light, but worry was stamped on her face. Daddy's taking longer than usual, isn't he, Mom? Peter asked, trying to hide his own anxiety. Yes, but I'm sure he's fine, Donna Clara replied, forcing a smile. Let's finish preparing dinner that your father will arrive hungry. Tony, can you put the dishes on the table, please? While Tony was doing his homework, his thoughts were with his father. He looked at the door from time to time, hoping to see Joachim enter with a smile on his face and new stories to tell about the sea. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Tony, always optimistic, ran excitedly to meet her. Dad, you're back, he exclaimed as he opened the door. But it wasn't your father. At the entrance stood a distinguished man with a serious countenance and a thick woolen coat. Good night. I need to talk to Mrs. Clara, he said, with a grave tone. Tony's mother, who was already coming from the kitchen, stopped when she heard the stranger's voice. Her heart raced, and she felt a chill down her spine. It's me. What happened? She asked, approaching the door, while the children watched with curiosity and concern. I'm sorry, please come in, Donna Clara said, trying to remain calm. The man came in, took off his hat, and nervously held it in his hands. My condolences, ma'am. I'm the captain of your husband's boat. I regret to inform you that there has been an accident at sea. The storm was very strong, and unfortunately, Joachim was thrown overboard. We couldn't rescue him. Silence filled the room. Tony's mother turned pale, her eyes filled with tears. No, that can't be true, she whispered, as her children, not fully understanding the gravity of the situation, burst into tears as they saw the pain on their mother's face. Tony felt as if the ground had disappeared under his feet. Dad, he muttered, unable to believe the words he had just heard. Donna Clara hugged her children, trying to find the strength to console them. Let's get through this together, she said, her voice choking. We need to be strong, like Dad always was. The news of Joachim's death deeply shook the family. The days that followed were dark and full of mourning. The small village in Alaska seemed even colder and more isolated without her father's presence. Donna Clara knew that she had to make a difficult decision for the future of her children. This is how Tony's mother, Donna Clara, made the difficult decision to leave Alaska and move with her children to Texas, where she had relatives who could help them start over. We have to move on, my children. Let's go to a place where we can find peace and security, she said, tears in her eyes. The move to Texas came as a shock to Tony. The stifling heat, the arid landscape, and the new culture were completely different from what he knew. It's going to be okay, Tony. Texas also has its beauties, Pedro said, trying to cheer up his younger brother still in a state of grief. In Texas, life took a new turn. Tony made new friends and discovered a passion for technology at the local school. He spent hours at the public library, studying computers and programming, something surprising for the boy who dreamed of being a fisherman in raging waters. You have a talent for it, Tony, said Mr. Thompson, his science teacher. The morning gradually gave way to new experiences, and although Tony never forgot his father, he still remained in his heart as a sweet memory and source of wisdom. It was already at the university that Tony met Sophia, an art student with a fascinating and very different worldview from his own. You need to see the beauty in every detail, Tony, she said, as they strolled through the city's museums and galleries. And although they were so different in their composition, it seemed that this difference was what gave contours to that relationship, and that was how they quickly fell in love, sharing dreams and plans for the future. It was one day while Tony was on campus that he bumped into Sophia for the first time. She was sitting on a bench, drawing with intensity. Tony, curious, approached to see what she was drawing. Can I see? He asked, trying not to sound intrusive. Sophia raised her eyes and smiled. Sure. I'm drawing that tree over there. It's kind of a project for my visual arts class. Tony watched the drawing, impressed by the detail and her skill. Wow, you are very talented. I'm Tony, a technology student. Sophia, she replied, holding out her hand. It's nice to meet you, Tony. It was from this simple but timely meeting that Tony and Sophia began to spend more time together. They met frequently on campus and shared their passions and dreams. Sophia had grown up in New York, in a very different reality from Tony's, and perhaps, deep down, one dreamed of what the other had always possessed. Why did you choose technology? Sophia asked one afternoon as they walked through the park. Not even I know, Tony explained. As a child, I dreamed of being a fisherman of raging waters like my father. But after my father's death, I somehow found solace in programming. I think it was a way of controlling a world that seemed to be falling apart. Sophia looked at him with understanding. I am sorry for your father. It must have been hard. Quite. Although we knew this could happen, we never imagined it. We hoped it would always be there. But my mother helped us overcome it. What about you? What brought you to art? Sophia smiled, her eyes shining with passion. Since I was little, I always liked to draw. For me, it's a way of expressing what words can't. Art allows me to capture moments and emotions in a unique way. Tony and Sophia shared a special bond, a mutual understanding that deepened with each conversation. They explored the city together, visiting museums and art galleries, where Sophia explained the details of the paintings and sculptures, while Tony talked about the latest technological innovations. Look at this, Sophia said one day as they looked at a Moderna sculpture. Look at how the artist captured the movement. It's almost like the stone is alive. Tony laughed, admiring Sophia's passion. I never thought of art that way. You really have a gift for seeing beyond the obvious. Over time, Tony and Sophia's relationship strengthened. They supported each other in all aspects of life, sharing not only their joys, but also challenges. One night, after a long day of studying, Tony prepared a special dinner for Sophia. I know I'm not a chef, but I hope you enjoy it, he said, placing the dishes on the table. Sophia smiled and picked up a fork. I'm sure it will be delicious, Tony. As they ate, Tony looked into Sophia's eyes and held her hand. Sophia, you changed my life. Before I met you, I was lost in my own thoughts, maybe aimlessly, not sure where I wanted to go. You showed me how to see beauty in the little things, and I am forever grateful for that. Sophia shook his hand and answered with a tender smile. And you taught me to appreciate logic and structure. I never thought I could love technology so much until I met you. We complete each other, Tony. It was shortly after they graduated that Tony and Sophia decided to get married. The ceremony was simple but full of love and meaning. I promise to be by your side in all the adventures that life has in store for us, Tony said, looking into Sophia's eyes. I promise to support and love you at all times, good and bad, Sophia replied, emotional. They settled in Texas, where Tony founded a technology company and Sophia opened an art studio. The life they built together was filled with love, support, and many adventures. The first years of marriage were full of discoveries and adaptations. Tony and Sophia learned to deal with small day-to-day differences, such as who made breakfast or who took out the trash. Despite minor disagreements, the love and respect they had for each other always prevailed. One evening, while Tony was working on a new project in the office, Sophia came in with a beaming expression on her face. Tony, I need to tell you something, she said, her eyes shining with emotion. Sure, dear. What happened? Tony replied, getting up from his chair and approaching her. I'm pregnant, Sophia announced, holding a positive pregnancy test. Tony was silent for a moment, processing the news. Then a huge smile spread across his face. Let's be parents, he exclaimed, hugging Sophia tightly. That's amazing, Sophia. The following months were a mixture of excitement and preparation. Tony and Sophia attended every doctor's appointment together, eager to hear the baby's heartbeat and see the first images on the ultrasound. It was at one of these consultations that they received surprising news. Congratulations, you are expecting twins, said the doctor, smiling at the couple. Tony and Sophia looked at each other, surprised and thrilled. Twins, repeated Tony, with a silly smile on his face. We're going to have 2 babies. The news of the twins brought a new wave of preparation. The couple turned one of the rooms in the house into a beautiful nursery, painting the walls in soft colors and filling it with adorable toys and clothes. Sophia, with her artistic talent, drew murals on the walls, creating a magical environment for future children. Finally, the big day arrived. On a quiet dawn, Sophia went into labor. Tony, nervous but trying to stay calm, rushed her to the hospital. Hours later, they heard the first cries of their babies. "It's a boy and a girl," the nurse announced, handing the newborns to their exhausted but beaming parents. Tony held his son in his arms, while Sophia hugged her daughter. "Welcome to the world, little ones," Tony said, thrilled. "You are everything we have always dreamed of." Life with the twins, who they named Lucas and Laura, was a whirlwind of emotions and challenges. Sleepless nights, constant diaper changes, and endless crying tested Tony and Sophia's patience and endurance. But at the same time, every smile, every laugh, and every new milestone of development filled their hearts with joy and gratitude. "Look at them, Tony," Sophia would say, watching the twins play on the living room carpet. "I can't believe we are parents to two such amazing children." "They're wonderful," Tony agreed, holding Sophia's hand. "And you are an amazing mother, Sophia." Over time, Tony and Sophia found a balance between their careers and raising children. Tony, although dedicated to his company, always took time to play with Lucas and Laura, teaching them about life and sharing their passions. Sophia, in turn, involved the twins in their artistic pursuits, encouraging them to explore their creativity. One night, while the twins were in bed, Tony and Sophia sat on the couch, exhausted but happy. "It's been an incredible journey, hasn't it?" Tony asked, pulling Sophia close. "Yes, and I couldn't imagine doing that with anyone else but you," Sophia replied, resting her head on Tony's shoulder. "We're a team, Tony. We always will be." Life continued to be a series of adventures and challenges for Tony and Sophia, but together, they overcame it all, supporting each other and raising a family full of love and happiness. Despite the distance and changes, Tony never forgot his roots in Alaska. He always told stories of his childhood to his children as they grew up, leading them through imagination to visit the place where it all began, and also the sea and the art of fishing. "Alaska taught me to be strong and to value family," he explained, as they gazed together at the engravings of the majestic mountains that meant so much to him. Tony paused, looking at his dogs who were lying at his feet. "After all this, I live alone with my dogs. They are my only family now." John was surprised by the story. "And where is your wife and children? What happened?" Curious, he asked, "How did you come to live here in Brooklyn?" "I was a happy man, married to the woman he loved, and we had our little children. At that time, we had moved to a small house in the countryside, surrounded by green fields and fresh air. It was a simple life, but full of love and joy." Tony paused, his eyes glazing over with the memories. "Sophia was an amazing, strong, and kind woman. Lucas and Laura were our sunbeams, always running and laughing through the fields. Those were the best years of my life." John could almost see the scenes described, imagining the happiness of the little family. "What happened, Tony?" he asked softly, fearing the answer. "It was a day like any other," Tony continued, his voice now darker. Tony and Sophia were returning from a walk in the park with Lucas and Laura, who were now 6. The day had been wonderful. They played on the playground, had a picnic, and even released colorful kites into the sky. The car was full of laughter, music, and various plans for the future. Tony wanted to take them to Alaska, where maybe they could catch some trout. "I was thinking of taking the kids to Alaska for trout season," Tony said, turning to Sophia with a smile. "What do you think?" "Great idea," answered Sophia, smiling. "They will love seeing the fish and learning about the marine life. What do you think, kids? You want to go to Alaska?" "And I would also like to meet," I said, excited. "Yes, Daddy. Let's see the fish," shouted Lucas and Laura, excited in the back seat. The car was filled with infectious joy. Tony turned up the volume on the radio, and they all sang along to the song he was playing. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Everything seemed perfect. Suddenly, as they passed a bend in the road, a runaway truck appeared out of nowhere. The driver, visibly drunk, could not maintain control of the vehicle. Tony saw the truck approaching quickly and tried to swerve, but there was not enough time. "Sophia, hold on," Tony shouted, trying to protect the family. The impact was brutal. The car was thrown off the road, flipping over several times before coming to a stop. It all happened in a matter of seconds, but to Tony, it all seemed like an eternity. The sound of metal twisting like in a sardine can, glass breaking, and panicked screams echoed deep in his mind for many, many years since. When the car finally stopped, there was an eerie silence. Tony, dazed and in pain, tried to move. "Sophia, children," he muttered, turning to see his family. Tony paused for a moment, fighting back tears that threatened to fall. The impact was terrible, and I blacked out. When I woke up in the hospital a long time after the accident, I was informed that Sophia, Lucas, and Lara had not survived. My life fell apart at that moment. The days that followed after regaining consciousness were a blur of pain and despair. Tony, with a bruised body and a devastated soul, struggled to find any meaning in the tragedy. The faces of Sophia and the children haunted his thoughts, their laughter echoing in his memory as a cruel reminder of what he had lost, and the laughter was replaced by the terrified scream before they fell silent forever, which tormented him, took away his sleep, and made him think of living in an eternal nightmare. At the hospital, he was visited by doctors, nurses, and social workers, all trying to offer comfort and practical help. But nothing seemed to penetrate the mist of sadness that enveloped Tony. One afternoon, Dr. Martinez, the doctor who cared for him, sat next to his bed. "Tony, I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, earnestly. "I can't imagine the pain you are feeling, but I want you to know that we are here to help you recover, both physically and emotionally." Tony looked at the doctor with empty eyes. "I don't know how I can do it, doctor. They were everything to me." Dr. Martinez nodded. "I know it seems impossible right now, but with time and the right support, you can find a way to move forward. It will be a difficult journey, but you are not alone." The following months were a slow and painful process of recovery. Tony underwent several surgeries to repair the physical damage and 100 physiotherapy sessions to regain mobility. But the biggest battle was inside his mind and heart. Every day was a struggle to find a reason to stay alive, to find some trace of hope in a world that seemed to have lost all its meaning. He wondered and asked God why he had survived. It made no sense for him to have remained alive, and also blamed himself for not having been able to protect his children, being ashamed to have survived in their place. Over time, and with the help of therapy and support groups, Tony began to find small ways to cope with his pain. He began writing about his experiences, trying to process the tragedy and find some meaning amid the chaos. The words, although painful, were a relief and a means of connecting with his memories of Sophia, Lucas, and Lara. A year after the accident, Tony visited the park where they had spent that last happy day together. Sitting on the bench where Sophia had drawn the children playing, he felt their presence around him. "I miss you guys so much," she whispered, letting the tears fall freely. The trial of the drunk driver was an event that Tony awaited with a mixture of anxiety and hope. The driver, a man named Carl Jenkins, had destroyed his life in an instant of irresponsibility. Tony wanted justice for Sophia, Lucas, and Lara. He wanted Carl to pay for what he had done. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. Journalists, onlookers, and friends of Tony's family filled the pews, all attentive to what would be decided. Tony, sitting in the front row, felt his heart heavy. Beside him, the family's lawyer, Mr. Thompson, took notes as proceedings began. "We are here to try Carl Jenkins, charged with driving under the influence of alcohol and causing an accident that resulted in the deaths of Sophia, Lucas, and Lara," the judge announced. "How does the defendant plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," the defense attorney responded. Tony felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew Carl Jenkins was guilty. Police had found extremely high levels of alcohol in his blood. There were witnesses who saw him drinking shortly before getting into the truck. All this should be enough for a conviction. During the trial, Tony heard the details of the accident once again. The graphic descriptions brought back all the emotions of the tragic night. He heard the testimonies of the police officers, the paramedics, and even some eyewitnesses. The defense tried to argue that Carl was not as drunk as he seemed, that there was a mechanical problem in the truck. "That's nonsense," Tony whispered to Mr. Thompson. "They're trying to find excuses." "Stay calm, Tony," the lawyer replied. "Justice will prevail." But as the trial progressed, Tony began to feel increasing unease. The defense was able to bring in a mechanical expert who claimed that the truck did, in fact, have a technical problem that could have contributed to the accident. They also brought in character witnesses who described Carl as a hardworking man and family man. When it was Tony's turn to testify, he looked directly at Carl. "You destroyed my life," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "My wife and children were everything to me. Now I am alone because of you." The prosecutor made a powerful closing argument, asking the jury to consider the overwhelming evidence and the devastation Carl caused. "We cannot let such a serious crime go unpunished," he said. The jury then retired to deliberate. Tony waited, every minute dragging on like an eternity. Finally, the jury returned. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" asked the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," the jury spokesman replied. "We find the defendant, Carl Jenkins, not guilty of the charges." Tony's heart stopped. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Not guilty," he muttered, incredulous. "This can't be happening." The judge thanked the jury and closed the case, while Carl Jenkins and his lawyer exchanged a victorious hug. Tony felt a wave of helplessness and fury wash over his body. How could the justice system fail so terribly? How could this man get away with destroying his family? Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Tony, seeking a reaction. "Sir, how do you feel about the verdict?" asked one of them. "How do I feel?" Tony repeated, his voice full of bitterness. "I feel justice has been denied. My wife and children are dead, and the man responsible for this goes home as if nothing had happened. This is a scam." In the days that followed, Tony was consumed by a sense of powerlessness and rage. "I couldn't sleep. I couldn't concentrate. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Carl Jenkins' face and heard the voice of the jury declaring him not guilty." The desire for revenge began to grow inside him, a flame that refused to be extinguished. "He can't just get away with it," Tony thought, repeatedly. "I need to do something. I need to take justice into my own hands." Tony knew that this path was dangerous, that revenge could destroy him even more. But the pain and anger were overwhelming. He began to plan, to think about how he could confront Carl, how he could make him pay for what he had done. One night, while sitting in the living room, looking at a picture of Sophia, Lucas, and Lara, Tony made a decision. "I will do justice," he said to himself. "One way or another, he will pay." They were hard and lonely weeks. Tony writhed during the nights and could no longer sleep, as if he lived in a constant state of alertness and hatred. It was then that during the early hours he began to create a plan to do justice with his own hand. With a heavy heart and eyes full of determination, Tony waits for the right moment to execute his plan of revenge against Carl Jenkins. He knows that this is the only way to deal with the unbearable pain he feels since losing his family in that tragic traffic accident. He felt that that would be the only way to erase with that hatred. That's how he bought a gun, and knowing Carl's delivery routes, he put his plan into action. It was late in the winter. He knew Carl would be returning from a delivery and would be passing through the city center at a peak time, heading towards the garage of the company where he worked. It was late afternoon when Tony sees Carl's truck approaching, just as he had planned. He follows behind the truck with his car, without losing sight of it, and little by little, they were engulfing themselves in the middle of the troubled traffic of the late afternoon. Luckily for him and Carl's misfortune, an accident further ahead caused the traffic to be completely blocked. Tony was shaking with anger with the gun in hand. He slowly gets out of his car and approaches the truck, waits for the right moment to act with the gun in hand, hidden under his coat. His thoughts are confused, mixing the anguish of loss with the coldness needed to execute his plan. Tony approaches quietly. He sees Carl inside the cabin, oblivious to what is about to happen, and the man does not recognize him. Tony's heart is racing, but he knows he can't turn back. That was the only way to end all that despair. With a quick, decisive move, Tony opens the truck door with no time for Carl to react and points the gun at Carl. The driver is shocked to see Tony there, and before he can say anything, Tony fires some shots. The sound of the gunshot echoes through the street and the surrounding cars and people who are startled by the scene, thus cutting through the silence of the night. Carl Jenkins falls lifeless in the driver's seat, while Tony, with tears in his eyes, looks at the man who destroyed his life. He knows that this act will not bring his family back, but for a brief moment, he feels a sense of relief mixed with grief. He felt that he had finally righted the wrong of justice that day. Wasting no time, Tony even calls the police and confesses what he did. He waits patiently until the cops arrive and arrest him. Tony knows he will now face the consequences of his actions, but he also feels a strange sense of peace, knowing he did what needed to be done. As he is led away by the cops, Tony thinks of his family and the happy memories they shared together. He hopes that somehow his revenge will bring justice to them, even though he knows the price to pay will be high. Tony stopped, fighting back tears that threatened to fall. "I didn't know," Tony said, "but my life fell apart even more at that moment." John was amazed. He didn't know if he was afraid or if he understood him. Tony leaned back in the armchair, closing his eyes for a moment, as if reliving old memories. John, sitting across from her, watched intently, his fear completely replaced by curiosity and compassion. The room fell silent as John absorbed the tragic story. "I'm sorry, Mr. Tony," he said, earnestly. "I can't imagine how hard it was for you." Tony nodded, his expression sad. "After the murder, my life was never the same. I went into a spiral of pain and despair worse than before. I lost my job, my friends drifted away, and I ended up isolating myself from the world. In court, Tony faces the stern gaze of the jurors and the heavy atmosphere of the room. He is dressed in his prisoner uniform, handcuffed, as he listens to the verdict being read by the judge. Tony Martinez, in this first-degree murder case against Carl Jenkins, the jury found you guilty. You are sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The murmurs in the room subside as the judge continues to talk about the details of the sentence. Tony remains motionless, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He knows he did what he thought was necessary in that moment of pain and despair, but now he faces the consequences of his actions. As he is led out of the courtroom, Tony meets the gaze of his lawyers, who look equally dejected. One of the lawyers approaches Tony as they are escorted by the guards. "Tony, I'm sorry. I know this is not what we expected." Tony looks at the lawyer with tired but determined eyes. "I did what had to be done. I can't say I regret it. I understand. But now we need to focus on appealing, on finding a way for you." Tony shakes his head slowly. "I don't know if there's a path for me beyond this one. I made my decision." "Tony, you have the right to appeal. Don't give up yet." Tony looks away for a moment before turning his gaze to the lawyer. "Thank you for everything you've done. Now I just want my family to rest in peace." The guards continue to escort Tony back to his cell. He walks with his head held high, silently accepting his fate. In the back of his mind, Tony knows there's no undoing what happened, but he finds solace in the idea that, somehow, his family will finally find justice. In prison, Tony Martinez plunges into a totally different world than he knew before. The first days are the most difficult. He faces loneliness, strict rules, and the constant feeling of being confined. The concrete walls close in around you, reminding you every day of the choices you've made. And in those extremely lonely moments, he found himself thinking even more about his wife and children. Tony spends his days following the strict prison routine. He wakes up early, participates in the mandatory activities such as work inside the prison or educational classes offered. Little by little, he adapts to life in the cell, sharing space with other inmates, each with their own story and struggle. Time in prison is a mixture of monotony and moments of deep reflection. Tony often thinks of his family, the memories they shared, and the decisions that led him there. He receives sporadic visits from his lawyers and occasionally from his two brothers, who bring the news that his mother had died. Meanwhile, Tony finds a different kind of community within the prison walls. He makes unexpected friendships, learns to navigate the complexities of relationships among inmates, and discovers small gestures of solidarity among fellow inmates. In the early years, Tony struggles with his own inner demons, trying to reconcile the justice he sought with the reality of life behind bars. He finds solace in reading, spending hours devouring books that offer a temporary escape from his limited reality, delving into classical philosophy, and also reveling in the classics, especially those that talked about life at sea, such as Moby Dick. As the years pass, Tony slowly accepts his new reality. He does not forget his family or the circumstances that led to his imprisonment, but finds peace in reconnecting with his own moral convictions and contributing positively, even in such an adverse environment. It was only in his third year as a prisoner that he eventually meets Father John, a man of faith and compassion who offers spiritual guidance to inmates. Tony initially hesitates to seek him out, but loneliness and the weight of his guilt after those years lead him to seek solace in the priest's words. "Tony, I'm glad you came looking for me. How are you feeling today?" "Father, I'm tired. Tired of all this." "Tony, are you struggling with something specific?" "Me. I killed a man who took my family from me. I wanted justice, but now, all I feel is empty." He confesses for the first time. "I understand your pain, Tony. It's normal to feel lost at times like this, but forgiveness can begin within you. It's about accepting the humanity in all of us, even when it's hard." "I don't know if I can forgive myself, Father. All I see are the faces of my wife and children, and the pain I have caused." "Tony, you're not alone in this. We all face internal battles, but it takes courage to face them. And the journey of forgiveness begins one step at a time. What if I can never forgive myself?" Forgiveness is not a final destination, but an ongoing process. Sometimes it takes time and inner work. But the important thing is not to give up on yourself, Tony. "I'd like to believe that, Father, but I feel like I'm carrying a very heavy burden." "Let me help you carry it, then. Share your load with me, Tony. Together, we can find a path of healing." In the solitary cell of the prison, Tony Martinez holds a worn Bible in his hands. He flips through the pages until he finds the Gospel of John. The words printed there seem to come alive, as he reads a specific passage Father John had mentioned in one of his conversations about forgiveness. Tony reads leisurely, absorbing every word. Jesus said to the disciples, "If you forgive someone's sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." John 20 verse 23. He closes his eyes for a moment, reflecting on the deep meaning of these words. The idea of having the power to forgive others and yourself resonates in his heart. Forgive to be forgiven. Is this how peace is achieved? Father John's words echo in his mind as he continues to meditate on the text. Slowly, he begins to see forgiveness not as an act of weakness, but as a way to free himself from the overwhelming weight of guilt and pain, and realizes that perhaps from the beginning that was the only way. Whether he forgave or not, he could never bring his family back, but by forgiving, he would get rid of that heavy burden. Unlike if he never forgave himself. Over the next few days, Tony revisits this passage several times. He studies it, reflects on his own experiences, and tries to apply the principles of forgiveness in his own journey of redemption. With Father John's guidance and his personal study of the Bible, Tony begins to feel a change within himself, finding a glimmer of hope and peace even in the most adverse circumstances of prison life. Tony spent 25 years in prison, paying the price for his revenge. During this time, he had a lot of time to reflect on his actions and the consequences of them. The anger that had consumed him slowly turned into a quiet resignation. He knew what he did was wrong, but he felt he had finally gotten justice for Sophia, Lucas, and Laura, and was finally able to forgive himself for it. Life in prison was tough, but Tony found ways to survive. He read many books, wrote long diaries, and participated in rehabilitation programs. He became friends with some prisoners and gradually began to help others cope with their own struggles. These years were not wasted. They were a time of growth and, in many ways, healing. Finally, after 25 years, the day of his release has come. When Tony walked out of the prison gates, he felt the fresh air and sunlight on his face. There was a sense of peace, but also emptiness. The world had changed immensely, and he felt like a stranger in an unknown land. He had no family, no friends waiting for him. I was alone. Without a place to call home, Tony decided to move to New York, a place where he hoped to find a new life and perhaps a new hope. Brooklyn, with its mix of cultures and rich history, seemed like a good place to start over, in a place where you thought you wouldn't be recognized. Upon arriving in New York, Tony felt overwhelmed by the vastness of the city. The busy streets, towering skyscrapers, and frenetic pace were a stark contrast to the solitary life he had led in prison. But in a way, they were also a sign that life went on, and he needed to find his place in it. Tony rented a small apartment in Brooklyn with the money his brothers sent him, being his share of the inheritance his parents had left. It was modest but comfortable, and offered the peace and anonymity he needed. Gradually, he began to explore the neighborhood, walking through the tree-lined streets and getting to know the local shops and cafes. He spent hours in libraries and parks, absorbing the new life that surrounded him. One afternoon, while walking through Brooklyn Bridge Park, Tony sat on a bench overlooking the river. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. He looked at the water, remembering the afternoon spent with Sophia and the children. Despite the lingering pain, there was a sense of acceptance. "I need to move on," he muttered to himself. "I need to find a way to live again." Determined to rebuild his life, Tony began looking for opportunities to reintegrate into society. He found a job at a local bookstore, where his passion for reading and writing found a purpose. The owner of the store, a kind man named Mr. Patel, saw something in Tony that made him believe him. "You have a kind soul, Tony," Mr. Patel said, as they arranged books on the shelves. "I think everyone deserves a second chance." Tony was beginning to feel at peace in his new life in Brooklyn. Work in Mr. Patel's bookstore had given him a new purpose. However, this peace was brutally interrupted when one morning, upon arriving at the store, Tony found a crime scene. Police were everywhere, and ribbons of insulation surrounded the entrance. A policeman approached Tony. "I regret to inform you that Mr. Patel was found dead this morning. It looks like a murder." Tony felt a shock run through his body. "It can't be. Who would do such a thing?" The policeman shook his head. "We are still investigating, but we have not found any concrete evidence so far." The next few days were a blur of sadness and confusion. The community was in shock, and the grief for Mr. Patel was palpable. Tony, who had developed a strong bond with Mr. Patel, felt deep grief at the loss of his friend and mentor. Soon, the police investigation began to focus on possible suspects. Due to his past, Tony quickly became the target of suspicion. Although there was no evidence against him, His history of revenge and imprisonment made him a convenient suspect. Rumors began to spread around the neighborhood. "Have you heard about Tony?" people whispered. "He's been arrested before. What if he did it?" Distrust and fear grew. Tony noticed that his coworkers were starting to avoid him. Even without proof, the shadow of suspicion was enough to drastically change Tony's life. He found himself increasingly isolated, with friends who once greeted him with smiles now looking away or crossing the street to avoid him. The conversation stopped abruptly as he approached. One night, while walking alone through the streets of Brooklyn, Tony sat on a bench in the park, feeling the weight of isolation. "I thought I could start over," he muttered to himself, "but it seems that I will never be able to escape from my past." Feeling lost and out of options, Tony decided to step away from public life. He quit his job at the bookstore and stopped teaching. His small apartment became his refuge, a place where he could hide from the distrust and judgment of others. He spent his days reading and writing, trying to find some trace of peace in his enforced solitude. "I can't live like this forever," Tony thought, looking at the pictures of Sophia, Lucas, and Laura. "I need to find a way to move forward, even if I'm alone." But even in isolation, I was falsely identified by a witness. Tony went on, head down. "I was in my home when the police arrested me, and I was brought to trial. For months, I was again treated like a criminal, and this time I could no longer get out of prison. But eventually, after these long months, they discovered the real culprit, and I was released. But the damage was already done. People still saw me as guilty for Mr. Patel's death, even after my innocence was proven." John felt a wave of indignation. "That's so unfair, Tony. The Lord suffered so much and still had to deal with this injustice." Tony smiled sadly. "Life isn't always fair, boy. But the dogs helped me find some peace. They both brought light to my dark days. They are my family now." In the dark days of isolation and sadness in his Brooklyn apartment, Tony found little solace. He spent most of his time reading and writing, trying to occupy his mind and ease the pain of isolation forced by the unjust suspicion of the community. One afternoon, as Tony walked the streets of the neighborhood in an attempt to clear his mind, he spotted a small mongrel rummaging through a trash bin in search of food. The dog had shaggy fur and sad eyes, but when he noticed Tony, he wagged his tail timidly. Tony approached slowly, speaking in a soft voice. "Hey kid, are you hungry?" he asked, crouching down to get closer to the dog. The dog looked at him suspiciously, but did not retreat. Tony took out a piece of bread he had bought earlier and offered it to the dog. "Come on, I won't hurt you." The dog sniffed the bread cautiously before taking it from Tony's hand and devouring it quickly. "I'll call you Max," Tony said, smiling. "Will you come with me? I have more food at home." To his surprise, the dog followed Tony into the apartment. Inside the house, Tony filled a bowl with water and put in some food he had saved. Max ate voraciously and then, with a grateful look, lay down at Tony's feet. "You're in need of a good bath," Tony commented, stroking the dog, "and I'm in need of a friend. I think we can help each other." In the days that followed, Tony and Max became inseparable. Max seemed to understand Tony's pain and somehow ease the weight of loneliness he felt. The presence of the dog brought a new routine to Tony's life, who now had someone to take care of. The long walks Tony took with Max through the Brooklyn parks became moments of reflection and peace. He began to notice small beauties in everyday life, something he had lost since the tragedy and all the isolation. "You really changed my life, Max," Tony said one night as he stroked the sleeping dog next to him on the couch. "I was lost, and you gave me a reason to keep going." Eventually, back to freedom, and with Max's help, Tony found a way to cope with his new reality. He devoted himself to writing, turning his experiences into stories that he submitted anonymously to literary magazines and websites. Although he could no longer interact with the community, he could still share his words and his life lessons, and in this way get some money, which was not much, but gave him enough to be able to live. Mr. Patel's tragedy and the subsequent distrust of the community marked him deeply, but somehow Tony decided he would not let the bitterness consume what was left of his humanity. He lived in isolation, but found a way to make his words reach the world, hoping that somehow they could touch hearts and change perceptions. And then came Luna, a few years ago, since she emerged and complemented our life with a lot of love. "You know, kid, it wasn't what I dreamed of growing up, but I really love the life I lead today. I was able to recover from everything I went through." "I'm sorry, sir." The boy was saddened by the story he heard. John left Tony's house with mixed emotions. As he walked back to the square where his friends were waiting, he felt a growing determination to share the truth. Upon reaching the group, he saw the curious and anxious expressions on their faces. "So, John, did you manage to talk to old Tony?" Peter asked, in a tone of provocation and disdain. John took a deep breath, preparing to tell everything. "Yes, I talked to him, and you won't believe what I found. Tony is nothing like what people say out there." The boys approached, puzzled. "What do you mean? What did he tell you?" asked Marcos, one of the most curious boys in the group. "Tony told me his story. He was a happy man, had a family, but lost everything in a terrible accident and sought revenge. After that, he was falsely accused of a crime he did not commit. Even after proving his innocence, people continued to treat him as if he were guilty," John explained, feeling the outrage in his own voice. "That's what he told you," mocked Peter. "I bet it's all a lie. You've been taped, right? And did you bring anything from there to prove it to us?" "It's not a lie, and I didn't bring anything. I ended up forgetting. So we're not going to hold up our end of the bargain." "Whatever," John answered as he walked home thoughtfully. In the days that followed, John continued to visit Tony regularly, and the friendship between them blossomed. John managed to get him out of the house more often, and with this bold move, even the neighborhood seemed to at least tolerate him again, although not everyone thought so. One afternoon, as they were sitting in the garden, John asked, "Mr. Tony, what have you learned from all this?" Tony smiled, looking at the horizon. "I learned that prejudice can be very painful, but also that people can change, and that each one carries with it a distinct story." John nodded, understanding the depth of Tony's words. "I promise never again will I judge someone without knowing their story. I will always try to understand before forming an opinion." Tony put his hand on John's shoulder. "That's all I could ask for, John. If more people think that way, the world will be a much better place." Despite the positive changes, not everyone had changed their attitudes towards Tony. The group of boys, led by Peter, who continued to harbor resentment and distrust towards him. They viewed John's newfound friendship with Tony with disdain and, in a way, without confessing, they felt jealous of the affection he received. "I can't believe John is now that old man's friend," Pedro grumbled to his friends as they watched John play with Max and Luna in Tony's garden. "He's still weird. We must show everyone that he cannot be trusted." "But how?" Felipe, one of the boys in the group, asked with a touch of hesitation. "We're going to break into his house when he's not there. We destroyed some things and showed everyone that he is a danger," suggested Pedro, with a mischievous smile. "We can leave a message on the wall. We have to get rid of it." The boys reluctantly agreed, moved by peer pressure. They planned the raid for the next day, when they knew Tony and John would be out, walking the dogs. On the planned day, Pedro and his group approached Tony's house while he and Joao were away. Carefully, they jumped the gate and entered through the window they managed to force. Once inside, they began to destroy everything in front of them. They broke furniture, tore up books, knocked over shelves, and spread chaos throughout the house. And finally, Pedro still wrote on the wall of the room, "Murderer." "I think that will be enough," Peter said, pleased with the destruction around him. "Let's get out before they come back." Tony and John returned from the ride, with Max and Luna running ahead, happy to be back. When they arrived at the house, Tony noticed something strange. The door was ajar, which was unusual in that he always locked it. "John, stay out here with the dogs," Tony said, with a bad feeling. He entered the house and was immediately struck by the sight of chaos. The room was destroyed, with broken furniture, torn books, and personal belongings scattered everywhere, and the large graffiti. John entered right behind, ignoring Tony's request to wait outside. "Mr. Tony, what happened? That's terrible. Who did that?" he asked, shocked by the scene of destruction. Tony stood in the middle of the room, his face reflecting deep disappointment and sadness. "I don't know, John. Someone did it on purpose," I said with tears in my eyes. John's words echoed in Tony's mind as he tried to understand what had happened. Despite recent support, this brutal destruction has reopened old wounds. He felt a mixture of pain and tiredness, an emotional exhaustion that seemed unbearable. "I can't stay here anymore, John," Tony said, his voice trembling. "I thought I could start over, but it just shows me that some will never change. I'd better go and find peace somewhere else." John looked at him with tearful eyes. "But Mr. Tony, what about us? And the dogs? We need you." Tony placed a gentle hand on John's shoulder. "I know, boy, and you don't know how much it means to me. But I need to do what's best for me and for Max and Luna." That same night, Tony began to tidy up his few possessions. The neighbors, knowing what had happened and moved by it, came to offer help and express their grief, but Tony was determined. The next morning, with the sun still rising, he was ready to leave. Before leaving, Tony said goodbye to John. You were a light in a very dark moment of my life, John. I will never forget your kindness and courage. Take care of yourself and remember not to judge people without knowing them. John, with tears in his eyes, hugged Tony tightly. I will miss you, Tony. Tony smiled, a sad smile, but full of gratitude. Thank you, John. Be strong and never lose your good heart. And so Tony, accompanied by Max and Luna, left the neighborhood, seeking a new beginning elsewhere, taking with him the hope that one day he would find the peace he had been looking for so long. Months later, John received in the mailbox a letter addressed to him. It was from Tony. When he opened it, she said, "Dear John, I hope this letter finds you well. It's been a few months since I left Brooklyn and moved back to Alaska, and I wanted to thank you for something very special. Perhaps you didn't realize it at the time, but your presence and your actions took me out of a comfort zone that I didn't know was imprisoning me. Somehow, you helped me rediscover the person I was and who I could be. Here in Alaska, I found the peace I had longed for. The days are long and often cold, but there is a beauty and a serenity in this place that make me finally feel at home. I returned to fishing, something I dreamed of doing since childhood. The sea, with its vastness and mystery, is both challenging and comforting. It's hard work, but it brings a satisfaction that I can't describe in words. My fellow travelers Max and Luna have never been so good. Alaska gave me the opportunity to start over, to live the simple, authentic life I've always wanted. Here, every day is a new adventure, and nature, with all its grandeur, constantly reminds me of the importance of living in the present and appreciating every moment. John, I wanted you to know that I am eternally grateful that you crossed my path. His presence inspired me to seek more, to break out of my isolation and find a greater purpose. It's been a long road to get here, but I finally feel like I'm where I should be. If one day you decide to visit Alaska, you will be very welcome. I would love to show you this amazing place and share some of the peace I found here. With gratitude and affection, Tony." Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.